The galaxy had always been shaped by conquest. Empires rose, declared their supremacy, spread fleets across the stars, and then crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. Every historian, every strategist, every child in a Dominion classroom knew the rhythm. It was inevitable, like tides, but tucked away in the margins of history. Never explained and never named, was a whisper that refused to die. They called them the ones who flee. The name was always spoken in hushed tones, usually by soldiers who had seen too much, or by frontier settlers who swore they'd witnessed impossible things at the edge of the stars. No empire had ever been able to prove their existence, yet their presence was unmistakable. Entire fleets reduced to silence, colonies annihilated, not enslaved or conquered, but erased as if someone had wanted to scrub their very memory from the galaxy. And yet, there was never any banner, never any declaration, never any claim of victory. Whoever they were, they struck with overwhelming force, left nothing but wreckage, and then disappeared. No survivors, no negotiations, no answers. The Valari Dominion, the largest and most disciplined empire in the Spiral Arm, dismissed the whispers as superstition. Their admirals scoffed at ghost fleets. Their archivists labeled the phenomenon as exaggerated war stories, and their rulers declared it nothing more than fear-mongering from weaker species. Admiral Catharis agreed at least. Until the day he entered the Dralic expanse, Catharis was not a man prone to doubt. A decorated strategist, he believed in hard numbers and ruthless discipline. His fleet of 160 warships was considered unstoppable. A spear of dominion will thrust into any region deemed in need of order. When the High Council assigned him to secure the expanse, he expected resistance from local powers, perhaps a few skirmishes, then a swift and orderly annexation. Instead, he found silence. The first signs were the wrecks, drifting hulks of warships torn apart as though something had reached inside and ripped out their cores. The debris stretched for thousands of kilometers, the aftermath of a battle so one-sided it hardly seemed real. Some ships bore scorch marks that looked surgical, as if their reactors had been cut free instead of detonated. Stations were no better. The Expanse's once thriving trade hubs hung lifeless, their interiors gutted. No bodies remained. No transmissions, no survivors, no looters. Just cold, echoing metal. Catharis ordered his fleet to scatter, to comb through the wreckage for clues. Hours later, one of his scout vessels returned carrying a half-melted data buoy. Barely functional, they played it across the flagship's bridge. Static filled the chamber first. And then a voice strained, ragged, trembling not from weakness, but from something worse, fear. They come not to conquer, not to rule. They come only as shadows. They are the ones who flee. It is not us who chase them. It is death itself. The recording ended in a burst of distortion. The buoy's memory core burning out. The bridge crew sat in silence. Some shifted uneasily. Others kept their eyes glued to their terminals, refusing to look at one another. In the stillness, Catharis' sneer cut through like a blade. Ghost stories, he muttered, turning away. Someone lost a battle and dressed their defeat in superstition. The Dominion will not. But his words didn't settle the tension. His officers had seen the wrecks. They had walked the corridors of lifeless stations, the walls scarred by violence that made no sense. More than one whispered about sensor anomalies, fleeting blips that appeared and vanished before targeting systems could even lock on. A few swore they saw movement in the void, shadows gliding between broken ships as if the wrecks themselves were haunted. Catharis ignored them. But that night, as he stood before the panoramic observation glass, staring at the Expanse's hollow starscape, something gnawed at him. He had spent his life mastering war, turning chaos into order through sheer force of will. Yet here, in this system stripped of life and meaning, he felt none of the certainty that had carried him through decades of campaigns. His fleet was the most disciplined in the Dominion. His ships bristled with firepower. His name commanded respect across entire sectors. And still, as he gazed into the abyss, Kethris could not shake the feeling that they were not the hunters here. Something was watching them. Something that had already been here, done its work, and left without a trace, save for the silence. The whispers of history were no longer just whispers. They were breathing down his neck, and for the first time in his career, Admiral Kethris wondered if the galaxy's deadliest enemy was not the one he sought to conquer, but the one hidden in the shadows, waiting for him to take the first step closer. It began as nothing more than a blip on the edge of the Dominion fleet's long-range scanners. The signal was faint, almost laughably so. A few scattered energy emissions, low-grade fluctuations that suggested failing reactors or perhaps derelict civilian craft. Admiral Kethris, already irritated by the endless silence of the Dralic expanse, saw it as an opportunity. If there were survivors from whatever massacre had torn through this region, he would wring answers from them. "Dispatch to corvettes," he ordered coldly. "Bring me back something useful." The sleek vessels broke formation and sped toward the source. Their chatter filled the flagship's comms, routine check-ins. Banter among officers confident that their presence alone would be enough to cow any scavengers or pirates. Then the chatter stopped. Not abruptly, not in one decisive cut, but in pieces. One voice trailed off mid-sentence. Another screamed a half-warning before static swallowed it whole. Then, both corvettes' signals vanished, their beacons extinguished as though they had never existed. The bridge fell silent. Cathara's jaw tightened. Where are my ships? Technicians scrambled, rerouting power to sensors, widening their scans, but the void remained empty. No wreckage. No debris. No sign of battle. Just absence. Moments later, their emergency beacons flared back to life briefly. Two distant signals pulsed for a heartbeat, then flickered out again. This time, the silence was final. Before Kethris could issue a command, alarms screamed across the flagship. Contact. A sensor officer barked, her crest feathers rising in alarm. Multiple vessels bearing 317. Closing fast. The displays lit up with new shapes. Dozens of them, dark and sleek, sliding into reality as though the void itself had given birth to them. They didn't decloak in any traditional sense. They simply appeared, blurring from emptiness into presence. Every ship in the Dominion fleet turned to face them. Weapons primed. Shields raised. Kethris leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. These were no Volari designs, nor any from the dozen minor empires he knew of. The hulls were jagged and black, built not for intimidation, but for efficiency. Predators didn't need to look terrifying. They just needed to kill. And then they struck. The first salvo came before Kethris could even open his mouth. Blinding beams of energy lanced across the void, carving into the nearest Dominion destroyers. 3 ships tore apart instantly, their hulls unraveling like paper. Crew compartments vented into space, fragments scattering like shrapnel. Return fire. Kethris roared, voice cutting through the chaos. The fleet obeyed. Plasma cannons unleashed torrents of fire. Missile bays spat storms of warheads. The void lit up in a fury of weapons discharge that should have reduced the attackers to slag, but the shadow ships were not there. They moved with impossible precision, weaving between Dominion salvos as though they knew where the fire would land before it was fired. Entire formations shifted in perfect harmony, their silhouettes ghosting in and out of sensor locks. When Dominion gunners thought they had a target pinned, the ships blurred, vanishing into the dark, only to reappear on a different vector. Another wave of attacks gutted 5 more Dominion vessels. Not a single shot returned had landed true. On the flagship's bridge, officers shouted over one another, panic creeping into their voices. Kethris slammed a clawed hand against the arm of his command throne, forcing silence. Hold formation. Concentrated fire? Predict their movements. But prediction was impossible. The shadows fought like no foe the Dominion had ever faced. They didn't strike in rage or in hunger or in desperation. Every attack was cold, calculated, efficient. The Dominion fleet had trained to fight rebels. Pirates rival empires, but these were something else entirely. They moved like an intelligence vast and coordinated. as though the entire enemy fleet was a single entity with 1,000 eyes and hands. The battle lasted for minutes. By the time the shadows vanished, melting back into nothingness, 8 Dominion warships had been reduced to burning wreckage. Hundreds of lives extinguished in silence. The survivors floated aimlessly, their ships too crippled to fight, their captains too stunned to speak. And just like that, the attackers were gone. No pursuit, no demand, no message. Just silence. The bridge crew stared at the fading traces on their sensors, disbelief heavy in the air. What? What are they? One officer whispered. Kethris didn't answer. His claws dug into the arm of his chair, gouging deep scars into the metal. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for him to offer reassurance, to declare that this enemy could be beaten like all the others. But he had no reassurance to give. The whispers of history, the so-called ones who flee, were no longer whispers. They were real. They had taken his ships, slaughtered his crews, and vanished without explanation. For the first time in his career, Admiral Kether. For 3 weeks, Admiral Kethris hunted ghosts. Every encounter with the Shadow Fleet followed the same agonizing script. A faint energy reading, a fleeting anomaly, a sudden appearance, then slaughter. No grand battles, no prolonged engagements, just precise strikes, carefully chosen, designed to bleed his forces dry. And each time when he rallied his fleet for a counterattack, their enemy melted into the void as though they had never existed. Kethris was not a man prone to obsession. Each new loss carved at him. The Valari Dominion's third expansionary fleet had been reduced from 160 ships to barely 120. Hundreds of thousands of his soldiers were dead, their bodies scattered as dust across lifeless stars. Worse than the deaths was the silence. No survivors, no captured enemies, no answers. He needed answers. His analysts combed through every fragment of data they could recover. Broken distress signals from other empires, logs retrieved from wrecked stations, encrypted buoys half melted by battle. Most of it was useless, but small pieces began to fit together. One buoy, retrieved from the ruins of the Karate Protectorate, contained only a single sentence. Scrawled into a corrupted log entry, "They run from shadows older than stars." Another message, pulled from a fragmented recording in a ruined colony, was more direct. "Do not chase them. If you do, you will see what follows." The warnings repeated across different tongues, different systems, different centuries. The wording changed, but the meaning was constant. The ones who flee were not running from their enemies. They were running from something else. Kethris didn't believe in superstition. He was Dominion. He had crushed rebellions, exterminated pirates, and shattered fleets twice the size of his own. He believed in logistics, strategy, and the power of overwhelming fire. Yet here, nothing worked. His numbers counted for nothing. His strategies collapsed against an enemy that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. The whispers began to spread through his fleet. Officers spoke of cursed hunters, of ships that were not ships, of shadows that were not alive yet, could kill with precision. Crews whispered that the enemy could hear their thoughts, that every maneuver was predicted before it was made. Kethris crushed such talk with threats and punishments. But even he could not ignore the creeping doubt. The enemy did not behave like conquerors. They did not hold territory, plunder resources, or enslave survivors. They burned everything, erased every trace, and vanished. And yet, they always struck at fleets and empires that lingered in devastated systems. It was as though they were cleaning up after something. One night, alone in his quarters, Kethris pored over the compiled warnings, his claws drumming against the desk. If these ones who flee were not running from him, from the Dominion, or from anyone else, then from what? And why destroy those who stood in their path? The thought unsettled him. They weren't predators. They were shepherds, cruel shepherds, cutting down anything that might slow their pace. Still, questions remained. Who were they? What species could command such discipline, such technology, such ruthlessness? The answer came unexpectedly. 3 days after his last encounter, a signal pierced the fleet's communications net. It wasn't a Dominion frequency. It wasn't any frequency known to Volari archives. It simply appeared untraceable. Echoing across every ship at once, Admiral Hiscom's officer stammered, "We're receiving a transmission." The encoding. "I don't recognize it. It's primitive old?" "Put it through," Cathris growled. The bridge fell silent as the signal stabilized. Static roared, then resolved into a voice rough, steady, and unlike any Catharis had ever heard. It was human. "This is Commander Elias Rourke of the Arcadia. If you're hearing this, then you've already seen the pattern. We are the ones who flee, humanity." Gasps rippled across the bridge. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Humanity. The word was a relic in Dominion records, a primitive Deathworld species, scattered across the stars, barely unified enough to qualify as a civilization. Their worlds were quarantined centuries ago, deemed too violent to uplift and too costly to conquer. The voice continued. "We never wanted war with the stars. But when we fought our first enemy, we discovered something worse. Something that consumes empires whole. We don't run from you. We run ahead of them. We strike down any power that might draw their attention. You call us predators? No, we're the warning shot." The recording ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. The bridge crew stared at Catharis, waiting for his judgment. But the Admiral said nothing. His mind replayed the words again and again. Humanity. The ones who flee, not conquerors. Not raiders, not ghost shepherds, fleeing before the storm. Cutting down anyone foolish enough to stand in their path. And if the recording was true, then the question was no longer who the shadows were. The question was what. They were running from the name humanity echoed in Admiral Catharis, mind long after the transmission had ended. 4. Most of the Volari Dominion? The species was nothing more than a forgotten footnote. An unstable Deathworld race from the galactic fringe, too dangerous to uplift, too stubborn to conquer, too fractured to matter. They had no empire, no fleets of note, no colonies worth claiming. The Dominion's official stance was to leave them quarantined, let their own brutality devour them, but the shadows that had humiliated his fleet were no primitive savages. Their vessels were sleek, fast, and devastatingly precise. Their tactics showed discipline and coordination rivaling anything the Dominion had ever faced. Cathris stared at the darkened holoscreen in the aftermath of the broadcast. Humanity had declared themselves the ones who flee, and worse. They had declared that their enemy was not the Dominion at all. They run. Ahead, he muttered under his breath. Not away ahead. The phrasing haunted him. The recording had not been a plea or even a threat. It had been a warning. The following days brought more fragments, more transmissions bleeding through strange frequencies as if humanity wanted to be found, but only by those willing to listen. Each message came from a different ship, a different commander, but all carried the same grim cadence. Do not mistake us for cowards. We flee not to survive, but to buy time. We burn the fields behind us, so nothing follows the scent. If you think us monsters, wait until you see what hunts us. These words spread like infection through the Dominion fleet. Officers whispered of a greater predator lurking beyond the stars, something even humanity feared. Crew morale frayed. Even the most disciplined soldiers could not ignore the unease of serving as bait in someone else's game. Catharis tried to suppress the rumors. He punished officers who spoke too freely, threatened crews with lashings for spreading enemy propaganda. Yet in his private chambers, he replayed the recordings until the voices of humanity seemed burned into his skull. Finally, a message arrived not as a broadcast, but as a direct hail. The shadows had returned. Human vessels emerged from the void like Wraith's 30 ships. Black-holed and silent, positioning themselves at the edge of the Dominion's formation. But instead of opening fire, they sent a transmission directly to Kethri's flagship. Admiral Kethris, a voice rasped, low and steady. The bridge froze. The language was Valari, yet spoken with a harsh accent, guttural and alien. The face that appeared on the holoscreen was scarred, human, its eyes hard with exhaustion, but unyielding. I am Commander Elias Rourke of the Arcadia. You've seen our work. You've lost men to it. Do not mistake this for cruelty. We do not fight you because we wish to. We fight you because you linger where you should not. Catharis leaned forward, baring his teeth. You strike Dominion fleets and expect me to believe it is not an act of war? Rourke didn't flinch. It is an act of mercy. If we let you hold these systems, if we let you build here, if we let you draw their attention, then when they come, it will not be your fleet that suffers. It will be your worlds, your people, your entire dominion. Who? Catharis demanded. Who comes? The human's gaze seemed to harden further. We don't know what they call themselves. We call them the Devourers. They consume stars, Admiral. They hollow out civilizations in weeks. Every empire that stood against them is dust. Every record of them is scrubbed clean because we burned it, so no one else would be foolish enough to look. The bridge crew murmured in horror. Catharis silenced them with a gesture, though his own stomach churned. You expect me to believe, he spat, that a forgotten species from a death world has stood against galaxy killers while every empire in history is coward? Rourke's expression didn't change. Believe what you want. But every time you chase us, you waste resources. Every time you fight us, you slow us down. And when you slow us down, the Devourers gain ground. He leaned closer to the screen. We flee, yes, but not from you. We flee toward the darkness, toward the threat so others can remain ignorant for just a little longer. If you think us liars, then follow. See what we see? Chase our shadows, Admiral. I dare you. The transmission cut. The human ships vanished again, melting into the void without a single shot fired. For a long moment, the Dominion fleet hung in silence. Officers exchanged wary glances. Soldiers muttered prayers under their breath. Catharis sat in his command throne, rigid as stone. He wanted to dismiss it as deceit, as a ruse to cover cowardice. Yet deep in his chest, something twisted. Humanity wasn't asking to be believed. They didn't need belief. They had spoken as Thomas. The words of the human commander gnawed at him, haunting every waking thought. We flee not from you. We flee toward the darkness. The Dominion's council had dismissed the message as primitive psychological warfare. But Catharis couldn't shake the unease. He wanted to prove the humans wrong. More than that, he wanted to prove himself right, that the Dominion, proud and eternal, could not be toyed with by a scattered race of exiles. So when long-range scans detected anomalous warp signatures ahead, human signatures, Catharis gave the order to pursue. The Dominion fleet burned through space, chasing the faint trails of shadow ships. Each day, more of his officers questioned the chase. Each day, the morale of his crews frayed. And yet, curiosity, dark, dangerous curiosity, pulled them onward at last. After 3 weeks, the chase ended. The fleet dropped out of FTL on the edge of a dying system. The star was dimming, its corona stripped, its gravity scarred by something unnatural. Whole planets hung hollow, cracked open as if scooped clean, and then they saw the husks. Ships, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, floated broken across the void. Some were Dominion, some Valari, but many bore designs older than any known empire. They were the fossilized bones of fleets that had once been mighty, now left drifting in silence. The human shadows were there too, small and pale against the graveyard of titans. They didn't run. They simply hovered at the edge of the wreckage, waiting. A transmission came unbidden. Commander Rourke's face appeared once more, grim and worn. You shouldn't have come, he said flatly. Catharis snarled, though his voice trembled. What is this place? The front, Rourke replied. Where we try to slow them. Where every race that discovered them has died. You wanted proof? Here it is. Before Catharis could reply, alarm screamed across his flagship. Sensors lit with distortions blooming at the system's edge. Space itself seemed to bend and shudder, and then they arrived, The Devor, no words could truly describe them. They weren't ships, as the Dominion understood the term. They were vast, jagged silhouettes, shifting as if alive, made of angles that hurt the eyes to follow. Energy bled from them like blood from a wound. They didn't travel through space, they erased it. Folding it aside as they poured through, one of them drifted close to a dead planet. In seconds, its surface began to peel away, breaking into rivers of molten rock that streamed into the creature's hull. The world was swallowed like fruit devoured by rot. On the Dominion bridge, silence reigned. Officers stared in horror. Some whispered prayers. Others simply wept. Rourke's voice cut through the terror. Now you understand. This is why we flee. Not from fear of battle, we fought them for centuries. We flee because standing still means extinction. We flee too, by a few more years, a few more days. For others to remain free, the devourers turned, whether it was hunger or instinct. They had noticed the Dominion fleet. Admiral Rourke said, his voice softer now, almost pitying, "Run." But Catharis could not run. Pride chained him, pride and terror both. He ordered his ships to fire. Lances of plasma, railshot. Warheads, everything the Dominion arsenal could unleash, lit the void. The weapons struck the devourers, and simply vanished. Swallowed. The great silhouettes shuddered, not in pain, but as if amused. And then they struck back. The first blast consumed 3 Dominion cruisers. Not destroyed, consumed. The ships dissolved into streams of matter that spiraled into the creature's hull. The screams of their crews echoed across open combs, cut short in static. More followed. The Dominion fleet broke, scattering, but there was no escape. Space itself twisted around the devourers, dragging ships back into their grasp. Catharis watched as vessels he had commanded for decades vanished like dust on the wind. Through it all, the human ships moved with dreadful efficiency. They did not fight to win, they fought to delay. Striking at weak points, luring the monsters away, sacrificing themselves with grim precision, Catharis realized. With dawning horror that humanity's legend was true. They were not cowards. They were not savages. They were the galaxy's eternal sentinels, running ahead of a firestorm no one else dared face, leaving only shadows so that others could sleep in ignorance, as his flagship shuddered under the pull of a devourer. Kether's last vision was of the Arcadia, its guns blazing, its hull breaking apart. Humanity buying one more hour for a galaxy that neither knew nor cared. The transmission burned into his mind, even as the void swallowed him. We are the ones who flee. We run so you don't have to. But when the curtain falls, remember, it was humanity that stood last, and then the Dominion fleet was gone.